All right, great day, everyone. It's Carlos, aka CJ, and I want to welcome you to a Gadfly public live stream. For our subscribers, thank you for subscribing to the Gadfly multi-channel network. If this is the first time that you're hearing a live stream on the Gadfly network, please consider jumping over to our site, which is the gadfly.vhx.tv, to learn about our subscription-based services. Also, we've launched a couple of different, social platforms as we continue to expand our multi-channel network. So we did launch a YouTube channel where we will place some of our public content. You can also follow us as far as our video releases on our Twitter handle, which is at the Gadfly MCN. And also we did create a Facebook page as well. And today I'm very excited. Today is Tuesday, April the 28th, and very excited to be joined by two great contributors, probably two of the best analysts that I've followed in my lifetime in terms of the work that they do on their own platform. So I have Ken Shortgun Jr. joining, who runs the shotguneconomics.com, and also London Paul, whose work you can find at theseriousreport.com. So Ken, Paul, great day, gentlemen. How are you?
Morning, all.
Yes, morning, all. Yes, very well. And all else you can say. I mean,
well, it's another Groundhog Day, and I think that one of the top conversations as we start to analyze where we've been and the next stages as we witness countries, states begin the process of trying to reopen, is just really understanding the economic impact of COVID and then potentially what the next stages are as it implies. And I think that, Paul, that you've coined it best in terms of COVID-19, which has been the great accelerator to the economic collapse or economic depression that we have been talking and discussing for numerous years. And it's just very surreal to be here at this time and witnessing these things take place. I thought maybe we could start by just some opening comments. We'll let you go first, Paul, and then we'll jump to Ken, and we can lead that into other conversation.
Yeah, as you said, the virus was just merely this accelerant of economic collapse across. I mean, I'm not saying it's not across the world, but particularly in the West. The West will suffer more than the East, even though everyone would like to believe that China's economy is in far more serious danger than the West, which of course it's not. And as we said before, it has many problems and challenges ahead, but the economic problem is the least of their problems in some ways, just to put that in context. But yes, the question has always been, whatever people's views on the virus is irrelevant. And there's always going to be this point where you say, well, okay, if you start to open the economy up, okay, we won't discuss what's the most pragmatic way to do that, although I think, there is a discussion for that another time, perhaps. But question is, okay, you want to reopen an economy, but the problem is the US economy, Western economies, were in the state of collapse anyway. And of course, the shutdown has just accelerated that collapse. So you can open everything up, but maybe as we go through today, we can discuss in more specific detail areas of this, but you're not going to be able to switch the economy back on because it was never vibrant. It wasn't even a fairly sort of fair to middling economy that was, bumbling along, not doing too bad. It was an economy that was wrecked anyway. And you can't resurrect a wrecked economy by doing, what the Fed's doing. And we'll talk a bit more about what the Fed's doing. But I think in a very broad sense, that's where we are. So my fear is a lot of people think, well, we'll just switch everything back on and the economy will return to normal because they believe, particularly in the US, that they've got a very strong economy, which they don't have, of course.
Ken, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the, just expounding a little bit on what Paul was saying, the particular thing people have to realize is that there's different levels of the economy. There's the financialization of the U.S. government, Wall Street, et cetera, the corporate structure. Then there's different states like Illinois, states like New York, states like California, who are, for better lack of the term, insolvent. Their pension systems are so underfunded that they're begging now taxpayers to bail them out. But you also have different states like Florida, Arizona, North Dakota, et cetera, that really are not in that bad a shape. Yes, their pensions are underfunded, but they're not really, they don't have the massive debt loads. And that part of the economy, that's where they really want to start opening up, get small businesses working, because at a certain point, Americans are not used to being idle and having nothing to do. Usually, as the old saying goes, idle hands are the devil's workshop. And we're starting to see that in a number of different places. Protests to demand reopening of businesses. The cops, that we were starting to see confrontations between normal everyday people and the cops over stupid things about walking on an empty beach. At that certain point, there's going to be that breaking point, and we're entering into the hot season. And history shows here in the U.S. during the summer months, protests and riots are at their worst when the heat is up and there's nothing better to do. So I think you got to take a look at the fact that, yes, absolutely, the overall financial system in the U.S. and particularly Europe, the coronavirus didn't expose it. It just really was an acceleration of what was slowly gaining speed towards a crash. We won't say collapse yet, but it definitely towards crash. But with that being said, now all of a sudden you shut down everything and you put the states and the different countries and the different regions who relied upon local economies themselves for their livelihood. You cut that off as well, and really you just compounded the problem tenfold. Now, the debate, of course, is going to be, well, is the coronavirus such a pandemic that along the lines of Spanish flu, bubonic plague, etc., that requires this? Well, fact of the matter is if you go back to 1918, certain areas and certain regions did shut off local economies and order a shelter in place. But for the rest of the country and around the world, it was status quo, and they just let nature take its course and dealt with it as it is. One of the interesting things that came out of that was the 3 years that the Spanish flu strains took their toll. It took about 3, 4, 5 years before people started actually congregating again. There was such a fear that even after officials had said that the virus and the flu and the pandemic had gone away, there was still a fear of associating with other people because it would be spread. You can call it superstition, you call it lack of information, good information, or news. But the longer that people are separated from this and given this fear mongering, the worse it's going to be over the long haul.
Well, I'd like to first start to talk a little bit around some of the narratives, and it's mostly here in the state side, and then maybe we can shift a little bit more towards international trade and the impact of lockdown and shutting borders down. But let's talk here first domestically in the United States in regards to the concept of this V curve we're hearing repeated numerous times by economists, by the administration in regards to, hey, you know what, we're going to be taking this ride down the hill with the COVID. Once things open up, we're going to start to see that V curve go back up. We're going to see the second quarter is really going to be low as far as GDP, but the third and fourth. I want to hear, gentlemen, some assessment in terms of what you feel are going to be the barriers to that, and understanding the dynamic changes that are occurring. And I'll let either one of you respond first.
Go ahead, Paul.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're going to say that because they can't go, well, actually, the truth is the economy is capitulating. Because, I mean, we know what the outcome of that would be. So they can't deny what's going to happen in partially, at least with Q1, and also, yes, largely the whole of Q2. But of course, they can speculate, say, oh, well, there's going to be this miraculous recovery in Q3, and by Q4, it'll be like it never happened. Well, of course, we'll set aside what the ramifications of the virus is or isn't, because the truth is nobody knows. And that is the truth. It may turn out to just fizzle out to nothing very quickly. And or we could be talking at the end of the year that it's completely spiraling out of control because everything did get out. But I don't know. No one knows. And that's an irrelevance in the context of the economic side of things, although it will, of course, impact. The problem you have is the US is now caught, and not exclusively the US, also Europe and Britain, because I now treat Europe mainland different to Britain because Britain's kind of sort of quasi out of the European Union, although not quite. And then you've got Japan, and all these nations are just printing money to shore up everything. So it's at the federal level, it's at the banking level, it's corporations. They're claiming they're going to end up bailing out small businesses. Remains to be seen. They're bailing out municipalities, cities, state. They'll have to do anything and everything. And the problem is it's a bottomless pit. So what they'll have to do is they just have to keep printing more and more and more money to shore up everything and anything. Never mind the bond markets, everything else. So what happens is the Fed balance sheet grows. It gets to 10 trillion, 15, 20, 30. Who knows where we'll be by the end of this year. The problem is, in the process, all they're going to do is flood the United States with Weimar dollars. And in the end, you'll have hyperinflation. When, we can't say, and there's no point speculating, but what that will lead to, eventually everything will be destroyed. And when I say, and that sounds harsh, but it's reality, there'll be nothing left standing that has any basis in paper. And that's coming, whether it's this year, whether it's next year, or whether it's in 3 months, it doesn't really matter. The problem is that's not going to improve, because as everything starts to capitulate, it's this death spiral. It's a death spiral for the dollar. Consequently, it's the death spiral for everything. So they'll just have to keep printing more and more money. And then eventually they'll probably have no choice but to print universal basic income, which people out there all think it's another control mechanism, which it isn't. They're not in control of anything anymore. This is a desperation to keep something going, which they can't keep going. And that's exactly what happened in Weimar Germany. They'll just keep printing till everything's destroyed, everything's wrecked. And then the point will come where a loaf of bread costs $10 or $15 or whatever it might be. And that's the point when the American people will actually turn around and go, right, this is it now. We've had enough of this. Because it will take things to get that bad before the American people realize what the real problems are. And I'm not saying it's unique to the US, it's not. You can arguably say Britain is in the same, but although British are a little bit more awake to the reality of things, hence Brexit and hence various other things. Europe, yeah, to a point, they're not very unhappy with things, but again, you have to take people to the edge of having absolutely nothing in paper terms. Then things will change. And the irony is, in a way, we can argue whether they should have locked things down. Okay, they did what they did, but in a way, they've accelerated their own demise. So yeah, the Fed can buy everything up. It can go in and buy states up, it can buy municipalities, it can buy every corporation, but they've all failed. Everything's failed. So the Fed has on its balance sheet $20 trillion of worthless crap. And in the process, they'll just keep printing more and more money, which debases the currency and wrecks everything. So all they're doing, in a way, all this virus has done, all the policy they've done is accelerating their own demise infinitely quicker in a matter of weeks. They've probably done what may have taken 6 months, a year. We don't know because we can't extrapolate that, but we know the economy was already in free fall. So let them bail out all these failing businesses and failing banks, because they're never going to be resurrected because they're just bust. So it's fine for them to do this, because at the end of the day, the only way this insanity in the Western world, this cabal, is ended is when their dollar is ended. So we always said, well, I've said it, the only things left standing when we get to the end of this, and I said this in 2007 when I worked in the bank, my exact words were, this insanity is going to eventually lead to the destruction of the dollar. It might not be in the next 5 years, But at some point, I said, all that will be left standing is gold and silver. And I maintain that, and I've never wavered on that in 13 years, because that's the only way it ever ends. If the dollar survives, if their economy survives, they can just carry on doing the insanity they've done. But once that's gone, it's game over. Because no one's going to ever believe them in the future that they're going to resurrect some magical digital currency. The world's rejected the dollar. They're not going to suddenly embrace another dollar because they decide it's called digital something. They're not going to embrace this. So unfortunately, it's a horrible, painful barrier that all Western nations principally will have to go through. The East's gone through a lot of this pain barrier. China went through a pain barrier for 100 years. Russia's gone through a pain barrier for as long as that, and has been going through its reset for 20 years since Putin became president. China likewise. So a lot of these nations, they've gone through this. We haven't. And unfortunately, we're going to have to go through this. So they can tell us all these wonderful analogies about the economy. On some level, they're banking on the fact that this money, all this printing, is somehow not going to create hyperinflation. But inevitably it is, because they bailed all the banks out and kept it inside Wall Street, the banks, in 2008. This time it's going everywhere. It's going to be printing money. It's going to make it out into Main Street. And eventually and the demand is only going to grow, because the problem is the more they print, the greater the demand is, because you're not going to fix anything. So they'll just have to keep pumping trillions and quadrillions eventually of dollars in to keep things not even afloat, just to prevent their collapse. And this black hole will just keep sucking more and more dollars in. And eventually, if a loaf of bread costs $10 and people need to go and do their weekly shopping and it costs them $500, someone's going to have to provide the dollars. So it just creates more and more. So this dollar demand, and that's what happened in Weimar Germany, why they were running around with wheelbarrows, because that's what happens. And sadly, there's an inevitability. That's precisely what will happen, because currencies are being debased to the point of insanity. And there's no answer to this. So as much as people, I think the problem is there's an expectation that the sooner we, if we'd never had this lockdown, we would have never had the economic problems. Well, we know that's not true, but there's still a belief that if you roll it all back tomorrow, that somehow it's magically going to fix itself. Well, it can't, because we've seen the amounts of unfunded liabilities in the US. What is it? They claim it's 200 trillion. It's probably 500 or 700 trillion. We don't know. We don't know how much money they've printed above 21 trillion. And it could be 200 trillion, it might be 100 trillion, it might be 50. We don't know. And this is what we're aware of. So if they don't print all this money to keep the municipalities and states going, they're going to collapse. But it's a never-ending problem. It's a black hole in every sector. So let them buy all this crap up, because it just accelerates the demise. Unfortunately, there's no way around it. It's going to be extremely painful. Well, my view is the sooner we go through this pain barrier, the sooner we can get out the other side, and the world can start to normalize, and we get past the insanity that's controlled the world through the dollar. And I'm not trying to solely put all the blame on the US, but the dollar's their genocidal weapon of insanity. Once they no longer have that, which is why everything's collapsing, because everyone's rejecting the dollar. That's why they're having to print all this money, because no one will buy their debt anymore.
Yeah, great commentary from both of you. It's very interesting to see that the creation of money, I think on large scale, the people that are tuning in here, our subscribers, understand what happens when you debase your currency and you print that much currency into the system. However, I think there's a good chunk of people, probably I would even say more than the majority, have no concept or understanding of that. I think that as long as they can use their debit card, as long as they can, pay for things, it's business as usual. But this time is different, and I think that's what's important, for people to understand. I kind of looking at COVID right now in terms of kind of a self-inflicted wound, if you will, where we knew the economic slowdown was going to happen regardless. However, when you start to see some of the impact of what's creating, in particular, with the supply chain here domestically, you're talking about now the impact that's happening to farmers, where they are literally having to throw out food product, primarily because it's kind of similar to oil. There's absolutely no takers, and they can't afford to pay people to come logistically to get the product or to even donate it. So they're resolute to that, is just throwing it out, which is just crazy concept to think of. And these are the things that are occurring, and we're kind of being shifted into two different camps. The camps are, one, let's begin the process of opening. Let's think through this and move forward. The other camp is, no, it's not safe. Let's stay at home. And the impact of that, what we're not discussing a lot of, is just in terms of the collateral damage that we're starting to witness, where we're starting to see people now that, hey, the wife and I are both, self-employed. We haven't worked now in 4 weeks, and I'm still having to stay at home, and I haven't received any type of government process. So in saying that, I think in terms of, here in the U.S., to understand the financial impact of the reality of what comes forth in terms of the jobs and the economic considerations. And Ken, I'm going to give you a second to respond to Paul as well, because I know you had some thoughts before we jump into the next question. But I think in terms of that economic reality is that, a lot of those jobs that were either shut down, or in particular the service sector, a lot of those jobs aren't going to come back. I hate to speculate on how many, but a lot of companies are going to have to do a lot of reassessment as to, how they scale and how they navigate their operation and business post-COVID. Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, I hate to say it, but you know what? I'm going to make this Tuesday the day of bad axioms, because you may remember personalities are not created, or I should say, now I've forgotten it, because I've had that on my mind for the last 5 minutes, and now I've forgotten it. I'll move forward to a new one. Yesterday in Twitter, I came to a revelation. We always love to blame the Fed. The Ron Paul revolution was about the Fed and the Fed. But the reality is that from day one, the purpose of the Fed is actually been to intervene to fix the failed interventions of elected officials. Case in point, it was the Fed did not end the gold standard. President Nixon did. That whole thing was built around wanting to expand the money supply so they could expand the Vietnam War and do the Great Society welfare state, elected officials. Then, of course, the creation of the housing bubble came during the time when under Bill Clinton, they wanted to provide housing opportunities to people who couldn't afford housing. So that required then the banks to have to loan to people that shouldn't get a loan. Then, of course, we offshored, thanks to NAFTA, we offshored all of our productivity, solidifying ourselves as a service industry. And that requires that the entire society become a consumer economy. And since people didn't make enough money in these low-paying jobs, then they had to force the Fed to open up the credit spigot so that everybody can borrow money to be able to keep the consumer economy going. Most of the actions of the Fed are simply reactions to what elected officials did to buy votes. And it talks about the incompetency, just like today, the incompetency. We have a global pandemic. Now, it may not be on the scale of 1918 Spanish flu, but what do we have? We don't have, like at 9/11, both sides of the aisle coming together. We have both sides of the aisle trying to determine how best they can use this crisis for their own political and ideological gains. So this is why even if we decide, or the country decided that it's going to go ahead and reopen, a great number of these jobs, a great number of these businesses are going to fall by the wayside. Nobody really knows. You mentioned the V curve that they keep propping up and promoting. Nobody really knows if people are actually going to spend money, because how many people right now, how many in the middle class all of a sudden have moved into more along the lines of the poverty class? The amount of rents and mortgages that aren't being paid is starting to escalate. That's going to accumulate even more. You got the potential for foreclosure. You have to wonder when these businesses are going to reopen. How many of them are not going to reopen? How many of them are going to be replaced by automation, robotics, et cetera, ad nauseum? It's almost to the point that UBI, Universal Basic Income, is going to have to be mandatory to keep people, the pitchforks, from hitting the streets. And it's not necessarily because they did a shutdown for 1 month, but think about this. Nearly every company that is demanding a bailout, they could not even have enough capital reserves to last 1 month before going insolvent. Capitalism is dead in America. It's pretty much dead in the West. It's complete reliance on creditism. And with that being said, how much can the bank, how much can the Fed, how much can the Treasury, how much can they print? It's already to the point that it's going to be continuous printing from here to eternity, as Paul mentioned, the Weimar. And if that's going to be the case, then is going to be able to keep up with the either high inflation, or once you get to the loss of confidence in the dollar, the hyperinflation that's going to happen. And usually when you have that type of lay of the land, the end result is there's going to be a small percentage of wealthy that survive. There's going to be a complete destruction of the middle class. There's going to be a vast number of poor, and a number of those poor are going to probably die. And that's the sad truth of where things are going.
Yeah, Paul, I forgot to say.
Well, I'd just like to
Yeah,
echo everything Ken said is absolutely spot on. And the truth is, the Fed has been controlled by the US Treasury ESF for decades. I'm no fan of the Fed. I'm not saying the Fed's policies are always accurate, but they are often very reactionary. And I think what we'll see before this debacle's over is the Trump administration will blame the Fed, or try to blame the Fed, for everything. They'll probably fire Powell, put some stooge in place to try and just smooth things. Because I think privately, the likes of Powell is turning around to the Treasury going, what the hell are you doing? And I really, and I'm not defending Powell or the Treasury, but I strongly suspect, even though the Fed's controlled by the Treasury, there is enormous backlash privately going, I don't believe, we can't, this is not sustainable. They're being forced to do it because they have to. But there's people inside the Fed now and everyone who must go, look, it's an inevitability what's going to happen now. And their fear is when this is all played out. And what Ken said is brutal, but it's reality. And it's going to unfortunately manifest itself across the entire Western world. And the big problem is, I don't know what percentage it is in the UK, the US. I reckon 75, 80, I don't know, 85% of people now literally are living paycheck to paycheck. So Ken's absolutely right. This is why, and also businesses, big corporations, even we're now starting to see, we're living literally paycheck to paycheck. Not that they have but you know what I mean, on a month-to-month cycle. And this is becoming prevalent, not just, I mean, we've seen it in the airlines, but we're seeing it everywhere.
Credit line to credit line.
Yes, yeah, and it is. It's like, yeah, and if you switch off the credit for 5 minutes, they're in big, huge trouble, and that is never going to go away. And the problem is that I strongly suspect that there's a lot of people out there who don't understand any of this, so they're not going to have any inkling. But I think there's a lot of people out there who frankly should know better and should be talking in these terms, who don't want to, because I don't know, maybe it's a fear of reputation, or a fear that they'll lose their jobs for doing this. But it's about time there's a lot more people saying, look, there's a brutal reality coming. But in a way, it's the only thing that's going to change people's attitudes in Western nations. When I've used the crude analogy, when a ton of manure lands on their doorstep and they can't get out the front door, then they're going to complain. But the problem is, and I think it'll happen here, although in here they're now giving everybody in employment 80%. The government's paying 80% of their salaries. I mean, how much is that costing on a monthly, 2 monthly, quarterly basis? And the list goes on and on. But it's absolutely right. In the end, they're going to have to bail everyone out with universal basic income, and it's not control. Nothing that the Fed is doing now, nothing that's going on is cabal control. It's cabal capitulation, because they have no choice. Because the fear is, although the fear is going to manifest itself, is when you have 300 million Americans. And I'll try and bite my tongue what I imagine they're really going to say. But the question I'm going to ask you is, what the hell has gone on with my nation? What the hell has happened? Why is my country completely destitute? That is their biggest fear. The cabal's lost control when you wake up the entire population, who then start asking questions because the ton of manure's on their doorstep. So there was no plan. Forget what other people believe caused the virus, but this idea they've hijacked it for their own benefit. They've not done anything. They're just accelerating their destruction because they're filling the balance sheet up with worthless assets, absolutely worth nothing. And in the process, they're just printing the Weimar dollars, which devalues the currency more for the reason I've said previously. So this is not a victory lap for them. It's a rapid acceleration to their demise. And it's only when people have got nothing that then they're going to turn around and demand things are done. And then hopefully at that point, people will forget their political differences, which is all engineered, and come together and go, right, we need to rebuild America. What do we have to do this? And it's going to take a long time, because they're going to have to embrace nations they believe to be the mortal enemy. China and Russia, two examples. So it's a massive problem of psychologically changing mindsets in people. But necessity is the mother of invention, and I think that nations will eventually change in that regard.
Yeah, I want to segment this out just a little bit. So I completely agree with both of you in regards to the government in itself. To satisfy the American people will have to continue printing money. There's no doubt about that, including providing income through this transition period. What I really want to talk about is, how does this fundamentally change the United States? I think Greg Manarino probably states it best when he talks about the transition period, where for so long that we argued against some type of socialist state being established. But then when you look at what's happening, you're seeing both corporate socialism, as well as now taking care of people. And then a lot of the talk in regards to the actual Constitution itself, in regards to some of these proposed changes that may be occurring as a result of that. So how does this fundamentally, are we seeing a consolidation of powers at the federal level now, and the federal level buying, either state bonds or bailing states out, the consolidation of the federal government to more oversight of the states is one aspect of it. But then the second of that is also, the constitutional side, where we're starting to see a lot of conversation in regards to what the federal government can do in the state. So what are your thoughts on that, gentlemen? And what I mean by that corporate type environment now is, let's face it, there's a lot of small businesses that are not going to make it through this storm. And small business has been, one of the lifebloods of the United States. And now we're going to see, the likes of Amazon, these big national corporations, be able to gobble up a lot of these small businesses that won't exist anymore. So what are your thoughts on how does this change the United States, and what does it do in terms of what people would be willing to accept in terms of constitutional changes?
I think in the short and perhaps medium term, until there's a fundamental change, and this is not going to happen quickly, it's going to happen over time. For the for the former Soviet Union, aka now Russia, it really took about 20 years to transition to what it is today. I look at it more as one of my favorite lines: "Who is your real master? The one who rules you or the one who pays you? Well, if the states are begging the federal government, aka the Treasury, and that to bail them out, then they, in the end, should be more than willing to cede some of their sovereignty to Big Daddy FedGov. The same thing with people. One of the reasons why the welfare system is such a powerful tool for governments is because the promise of that money ensures that that your behaviors and your voting takes place in a certain way that they want. So if UBI comes in, all of a sudden, the vast majority of Americans now are beholden to the federal government. And as we saw with 9/11, if you're willing to give up your own self-reliance and self-responsibility for others to protect you, then you inevitably are going to have to live with the consequences of the fact that those who are providing the protection are going to do it as they see fit, not as the way you would like it to be. So I think depending upon what steps are going to be taken, if it's going to be now a continuous unemployment / UBI, then people are going to have fewer and fewer rights. They may not want it, but in essence, all the government has to do is shut down your paycheck. There's no jobs for you to get. What are you going to do? You're either going to starve, your family's going to starve, or you're going to give in to Big Brother and what big government wants. Inevitably, though, something like that, fear and terror cannot last over the long run. People have to either buy in, or eventually, as Gerald Celente says, when people have nothing left to lose, they lose it. So there's that fine line in that window of how long that fear, terror, and the promise of money is going to go ahead and keep people, placated until that certain point when the government, when hyperinflation hits, when nothing that the government does except tyranny is going to go ahead and keep the people secure and safe. So how long that is, I don't know. But the reality is that the debt levels are accelerating so high, so fast, that we're not talking decades. We're talking probably less than 5 years, and possibly any real black swan that comes could trigger that across the board. It's one of the reasons why the UN has been talking about demanding a debt jubilee for emerging markets and poverty-stricken countries. It's the same reason why more and more countries in the East and in Eurasia are de-dollarizing, why Europe is moving more towards China and Russia and away from the United States. People like to think that the COVID-19 was a black swan. It wasn't. It's no different than recognizing a hurricane is coming on. It's something that happens in nature every few decades, just like cycles. It's not a black swan. What is that black swan going to be? I still think it's going to come, and it's going to come probably in a very short amount of time. And that could be the delimiter that really sets everything on its head. And there's not a single thing that the U.S. can do, the government can do, that people can do, or even the world can do until the aftermath of the consequences of it.
Paul, go right ahead.
My view is this is in no way ever going to amount to any power grab of anything, because you're already seeing across the US, you've seen it as well as I've done, that people have had enough of being in lockdown. There's people protesting everywhere and they're sick of it. Now, that's just a few weeks of what this, if this unravels as it will do, and okay, they may have to start bailing out tens and millions and more Americans with universal basic income. That's not going to be a controlling mechanism. That's a mechanism to stop the American people and 100 million of them deciding to turn up in Washington and express their dissatisfaction, and I'm being extremely polite here, with what's going on. So they are absolutely terrified of what the consequences are going to be, because the one thing they've been able to do for decades is pacify Americans to the point that they didn't need to understand what was really going on abroad. They could fool them, deceive them, because notionally, at least, the American way of life was trundling along and it wasn't really impacting too many people, although it started to crater in the last decade, that illusion to some extent. But when it affects the entire population, they're powerless, because then the people, you can't lock everyone down and give them universal basic income and say you have no freedom or liberty to do anything, because they're not going to tolerate it. That's their worst nightmare. Is they didn't care what happened in the United States. Their power grab and their whole ambition is outside the United States. Just keep things ticking along. Just keep the American people blinded from what's going on, because as long as there's no major serious economic problems internally, we could just keep the deception of the Democrats and the Republicans, and it'll keep them all happy, and they'll just be blinded to what's going on. And meanwhile, we'll just go and spend $700 billion a year, blowing the world up, and trillions of dollars, and they won't even realize they should have spent it at home. Well, when everything capitulates like the US has never seen, I mean, yeah, it'll be not even comparable to the Great Depression. It will be even worse than that. So, and the attitude of the people, 90 years later, is not going to be how they were then. So this is their worst nightmare, and there's no way out of it for them. So they're going to have to be extremely careful how they handle this. And they can, the federal government can say, right, we need to bail out, Illinois, or we need to go and bail out Chicago, or whatever it might be, or we need to go into California and bail everything out. Well, that's not going to be a question of controlling things. And the other thing is, they haven't got the capability to control it. That's why you have all this divestiture, notionally, of power, for want of a better word, to all these 50 states, because you can't manage a nation of 4 million square miles and 340 or whatever million people. So there'll be a perception in American people's minds that it's control. And the universal basic income, a lot of people in social media and alt media are going to see it as a control mechanism. They'll see everything as this overarching state control of things, because that's the perception of what they think socialism and control is to I mean, some people see it as a free meal ticket granted. Yes, they do. And in some cases that might be true. But this is a matter of them trying to survive and prevent their destruction, because they are terrified, literally, of what the consequences will be when you make hundreds of millions of American people destitute, because they're not going to sit there and go, I'm going to put up with this. I'm just going to tolerate this, when they've got nothing. I mean, you look like a lack of freedom of movement. They're going to have no freedom of movement because they're going to have no disposable income. And what's $1,000 or $1,500 a month going to do when the price of a loaf is going up and accelerating on a weekly, monthly basis? There's no solution to this. So, okay, I don't live in the US, but the same can be applied in the UK. But I don't. There's no control to this. This is their demise. This is their end. This is their collapse. The thing they're trying to think is, how the hell do we get out of this without 100 million Americans turning up in Washington or wherever going, I'm sorry, this is unacceptable. Imagine they all turn up armed. With who knows what they'll be armed with. There's no solution to this for them. This is them trying to just bail out the time. And okay, as much as on the one hand I talk about the virus the way I do and people disagree with me, but I'm absolutely not on the side of this idea that this is some gigantic power grab where they're going to vaccinate everyone and stick them in hamster wheels and turn us into AI and all that stuff. That's never a reality, and it was never going to be a reality. This is just a story that is being pumped in the alt media and it's now become like the Goebbels mantra. If you say something enough, people believe it, and it's now become an established belief. That's what's going to happen. Well, do we really seriously see 300 million Americans standing there going, this is great, this is fine. then they're fearful of the federal government a lot anyway. They're not going to tolerate this. And the cabal, in its form as it is now, which is rapidly disintegrating, is facing their moment of reckoning that what they've done to the rest of the world for decades is now going to come back and be what you reap, you sow. But unfortunately, they're now sowing it in their own nation. And that is the absolute worst possible nightmare, because they can't justify to the American people what's going to unfold.
Yeah, I definitely don't want to turn it into we'll save the whole vaccination discussion for later on. But I think, but Paul, I think that part of the reason why people see that as a potential is when you see two larger states here in the United States, New York and California, already institute these vaccination schedules and requiring it mandatory. So that's why people are a little bit, cautious and concerning about, if that takes hold and goes more national. So,
well, yeah. Look, I'm not trying to suggest and diminish or just throw out fears out the window. But the point is, they're nowhere near a vaccine. I know everyone thinks, oh, there's trials going on. That means they'll have one ready next week. They're not. They won't. I mean, ordinarily to do a vaccine, whether we're not discussing, by the way, before anyone gets in touch with me and says, you must be pro-vaccination. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just talking about the process takes 5 years. Okay, they might accelerate it and try to do it in 12 months or whatever. Well, what are they going to do in the meantime? Just keep everyone shut down for 12 months where with no job, no prospect, no nothing. And the American people are going to tolerate this? No. And I think the problem is, it's like, I've seen all over Twitter the whole thing about Gates, and people are talking. And I made a tweet today. I find it strange how everyone talks like Gates speaks for the world. Gates doesn't speak for the world. He doesn't speak for anybody. Gates speaks for himself, and he's got some whatever his agenda is. I'm not even going to go into that because that's not really the point of what we're discussing. But everyone's fixated. Every time Gates breathes, it's all about what Gates says. Well, maybe the future is that Gates is of no relevance to anything, and that's the problem. It's like everyone's just getting sucked into things because the alt media has been saturated for longer than I care to remember with all these ideas that the greatest one that did the rounds for decades is they're going to put everyone in the US in FEMA camps. They're going to have martial law. And then you ask yourself, how do they even do that? It's absolutely impossible to do that. They don't have the resources to do it. And what are they going to do? Start doing it in one state? Do you think the rest of the other 49 states are going to sit there and go, this is acceptable? So, no, there's going to be a fierce resistance to everything. And you can convince people in peacetime when things are ticking along normally to do things. But when the situation comes where people have lost everything, they're not going to tolerate everything. I mean, if we think they have a distrust of the federal government now, what they're going to have distrust to the power of infinity in terms of trusting anything that happens in the future. And the issue is that it's become because people are so distrustful of everything, and it's perfectly understandable, that everyone's getting sucked into things with regards to the virus, with regards to vaccination, instead of, and you made the point before we came on, CJ, and I've been banging this drum for the last few weeks, people should be worried about food security. Worse, because we're seeing problems with food distribution in the US already. It's not happened in the UK or Europe, but it might happen in the future. If the whole world just locks down and refuses to export raw food, we're going to have massive problems. So worrying about a vaccine that may never happen, or worrying about this, that, and the other is nothing to compare to putting a food on your, on the table every 3, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, for example. These are the problems that is far more concerning. But everyone's been sucked into things, and I understand why. But there's far more important imperatives that people look at and address as to, okay, if you have a lockdown or don't have a lockdown, well, the important thing is food security has to keep carrying on. You have to get the imports. You have to ensure that food is transported across the United States, and all these supply chains and factories do stay open to process and produce food. That's a matter of national security, and no one is asking the Trump administration or questioning anyone, why the hell isn't this happening? No, they're all getting sucked into things that really at the moment are of no relevance. It's a matter of prioritizing what's important. And okay, that's just my opinion, but I'd be far more concerned why your food supplies are going to be curtailed, why they're throwing tons of milk away and having to slaughter pigs because no one, just for the hell of slaughtering them, because nobody wants the pork. No, there's no demand for this food, which I find staggering. Where's all the complaints to the Trump administration, federal government, local government saying, why the hell is this happening? I mean, I don't. That's the part I find staggering. It's a matter of prioritizing what's important.
You're hitting some important points, because the thing about it is division of responsibility. Okay, when it comes to businesses or whatever industry in a particular region, that should be, to be honest, determined, regulated, and looked at the local level. Okay, the first thing people do, federal government, president, it's his fault. Well, no, the fact of the matter is that in places like Wyoming or Texas or whatever, that should be the bailiwick and the responsibility of the governor or the local better business bureaus that deal with either the oil sector, the ranching sector, etc. Leave the frickin' federal government out of it. But we've gotten into this habit of blaming or either demanding something from the top or blaming the top, when reality the issues can be settled at more local level. And this is why you're seeing the protests. They're not protesting against Trump. They're not protesting against Congress. They're going to the state capitals and demanding, open up the businesses. Okay. And frankly, it does come to that question. Whose right is it for these elected officials to make determinations for everybody, especially since they're absolutely incompetent, to go ahead and say, okay, we're going to shut down the country or we're going to shut down the state. And in reality, the people are saying the cure is now worse than the problem. While you have the Cuomos of the world saying, well, you can't put a price on human life. Yeah, you can. It's called $7 trillion in just 45 days. Plus, it's the fact that you have 528 people who are suddenly out of work for every one person who's died to this. In the end, more people will die because they shut down the economy than who die from the virus. But because you have such fear-mongering and because you have such incompetency at the leadership level, they're not making rational decisions. I.e., you know what? New York, California, Seattle, and a few other small places around the country, Washington, D.C., are being hit hard by this epidemic or this pandemic. Okay, lock those places down. The rest of the country is hardly seeing anything. If you kept the rest of the country open and functioning and being able to supply and keep the factories open, the food production open, at least you would have a chart, something moving in the country, instead of making it one blanket policy where it's not necessary in about 38 out of 50 states. That, to me, when you make a blanket policy without judging the fact that every region is different, every state is different, every community is different. That's why reliance upon Washington, D.C. or the Wizard and Emerald City, to quote the Wizard of Oz, relying upon that when they have no idea what's going on in Phoenix, Arizona, or in El Paso, Texas, is one of the biggest absolute travesties that will make this much, much, much worse than it actually is.
Oh yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, I mean, the problem is the US is really 50 independent nations, for want of a better word. So yes, I mean, the governmental structure is very different. I mean, we have local government, but obviously it's not on the same level as state governance. So maybe how I explained it was incorrect, but my point is that there is not enough focus on prioritizing what is important. But you're absolutely right. There are certain states in the US where you could arguably say, well, but then the problem is, okay, how, and you're better placed at understanding this than I am. Okay, let's say you open up Arizona and you just go, right, let's just get rid of all the lockdown. Let's just not have any lockdown. Okay, but Arizona is dependent on it can't be just an isolated state that just functions solely independently from the rest of the United States. So how does that interaction then work with the rest of the US? I mean, that's my
No, my point
immediate
is
question.
that, yeah, but that's why I said there were 38 out of the 50 states. When you take a look, only 8 to 10 have a large amount of not only those who have been diagnosed as sick, and I'm not talking asymptomatic. I have come to the realization that a large portion, at least 20%, if not more, of Americans have gotten the virus in some capacity or whatever. I don't know if you saw the study that came out from Stanford, and I got into a Twitter war with somebody who said, we need a peer-reviewed this bloody thing has been going on for 45 days. How are you going to get a peer-reviewed thing that takes years
but to be fair, I'm not saying that the Stanford thing's wrong necessarily, but I do agree that you at the moment getting peer reviews is not really practical. But I tend to think that is a valid point on some level. And the problem is studies come out and people veer to one thing or the other because it supports their viewpoint. That doesn't make the Stanford thing wrong, by the way, or anyone else right. But the issue is, yeah, I agree. You can arguably say with certain states it's far more applicable to open them up. But look, here's the problem, and this is again, it's not this draconian thing of shutting everything down to take control and put us all in hamster wheels. The problem and the fear is, and this, I hate to use Russia as an example, but the one thing we can all agree on is whether people like Putin or hate him. The guy's very smart. He's got a long track record. He's very intelligent, and he has been extremely ultra cautious about Russia. Now, Russia's landmass is enormous compared to the United States. So you could arguably say, and it has half of the population as well. Now, he's been extremely cautious. And the question I always ask myself is, okay, we can accept the Western crass incompetence, stupidity, and everything else, and corruption and all the other stuff that goes on. But when I look at someone like him, I say to myself, why is he being this way? Why is he doing this? He's not doing this because it benefits him to keep the Russian economy closed down or anything like that. He's posing significant political risks to himself by doing this. So there has to be a reason. Now, that doesn't mean the state of Arizona shouldn't open up or 20 other states shouldn't. The problem is, the question is, why of the reluctance? Well, the reluctance is because there's this big unknown factor as to what the second wave of the virus may be, how you may open everything up, and it may or may not cause problems. And it's back to my point. This is a gigantic unknown with a lot of maybe insignificant risk or enormous risk. Nobody knows. That's why Putin's doing what he's doing, because he's taking the viewpoint, I can't take that risk. Yes, there are enormous economic risks, and yes, that poses enormous problems. But there's a reason why people like him are doing it. So I immediately look and go, okay, what's the rationale for Putin to do that? And because if he just opened everything up and the Chinese were doing it, then you'd go, hang on, what the hell's going on? But when I see nations like Russia doing this, for me, that raises a fundamental question. Now, there are a lot of unknowns that may never materialize. And probably won't, or possibly won't. But what happens if you open everything up And in 3 months, you get a second wave, and the second wave is a far worse than the first. It generally is worse, but not necessarily far worse. Imagine if suddenly you then have a huge problem that wasn't a problem. Now, if that's running around in your head as a problem, and I was sat there, and I'm not defending Como or anyone else for that matter, but if I was sat there as the head of, as you know, whatever, I'm not sure what you refer to them as, someone who's the sort of head of the state of Arizona, whatever title they're given, and I'm sat there going,
Governor.
right, governor, yeah, that's it. If I'm sat there as the governor, I'm going, right, okay, I've got an unknown risk here. I don't know what the potential outcome is going to be. That's going to weigh heavily on my mind if I have even a sliver of conscience about things. That doesn't mean it's right to do it, but I think that's why Russia's doing what it's doing. So for me, there's an unknown factor that is causing a lot of fear, but it's not necessarily correct to have that fear, and it may prove to, with hindsight, to be the absolutely wrong thing to do. But I do genuinely think there is something, and I've said this in a number of weeks, that terrified the hell out of the Chinese, and it's terrifying the hell out of the Russians. When I see two nations like that doing that, I then ask myself, why are they doing this? And I think we need to sometimes ask ourselves those awkward questions and say, maybe there's a damn good reason why they're doing it.
I look at it this way, and there's a big difference to me between somebody like Putin, who, I don't have all the information, but what he has done is he's not making blanket policies. He's fluid. He's making adjustments on the fly as things evolve. He keeps some things open as things change. Then he makes adjustments, but he's always watching. Here, one thing, it goes back to what I said. We do not have competent leaders. We have politicians. Politicians look out for their own self-interests. Okay. The other thing that happens is that you have agencies that are looking out for their own self-interests. This is why Fauci, when he first came out, he's 2 million people, and we're going to have to keep everything locked down for 18 months. He doesn't understand the economic or the other side of the coin. He only sees it from his little perspective. The same thing with the amount of bad misinformation and that's coming out from the World Health Organization. First in January, they said, it's not a big deal. And then all of a sudden they change and make it a thing. Fact of the matter is that this information was out there. They chose to use it for whatever political motives that they wanted to. With that being aside, when you have, after a certain amount of days, like I said, it's really been about 45 days. We'll call it the middle of March, when decisions were being made. After those 45 days, you start making adjustments. I'm not talking about you open up states in the economy to the way it was, but you start opening up certain things to get people working, to start showing at least improvement. If people have hope and motivation that something is going to occur, they are far less, bent towards saying, you know what, I'm stuck at home. This historically, being inside and shelter in place is one of the worst things you can do for a virus. Getting outside and having that ability, taking the responsibility of just naturally, staying away from people, but still having that social connection is vastly important. Because if in the end, like I said, one of the things that came out of the Spanish flu epidemic in the US is that people got so scared that they did not associate with anybody for about 2-3 years afterwards. And it was a devastation because that was one of the big reasons why we had the recession, or a deep recession, from the 1920 to about 1922, 1923, is because people were so afraid that there was going to be another wave hit that they pretty much stopped living, much less getting back to work and getting the economy going. Fear is a more detrimental thing than actually facing the problem as it comes.
Oh,
In my
absolutely.
in my opinion, the important thing to do is after a certain amount of days, yes, you can't know every factor, but you do have a good understanding. Um, you know, that's one thing I'll at least give on Trump is he's at least saying on May 1st, start opening things up. Yes, he has his political motivations for doing so. He's trying to win an election. He needs the economy moving. But the reality is that you need to start putting experimental things in the economy, getting people out there and seeing what the reaction is. Yes, there could be the second wave. Yes, there could be the third wave. Well, right now, you cannot base your future completely on unknown and potential factors when reality is hitting you squarely in the face, especially at the same time that think about this. What has all hit? We've got the locust swarms that are affecting Africa to extreme degrees. We've got this pandemic that's hitting around the world. We're seeing the financial collapse happen. Everything is happening at once. It's not just the COVID-19, and you can't base your entire decision-making process on one factor while the rest of the elements are destroying you from underneath.
Oh yeah, no, I completely agree that sitting there and doing nothing is not the answer. And absolutely, I'm just saying that the rationale, and I'm not saying it's correct. I'm just saying the rationale is the fear. Look, here's the fear, and it may transpire not to be relevant, but yeah, you're absolutely right. There's the psychology of locking people down. In essence, is going to affect some people extremely badly, or people to varying degrees are going to get the equivalent of cabin fever. And I think I said once, I don't know whether I said it on air, but when I worked in the bank, we had secure rooms, and it was used by, you just had your little card and swiped yourself in and out. And for some reason, there was about 10 of us in there, and it failed, and we couldn't get out. Now, this room wasn't particularly small, but then they had to find someone who had to fix it and get us out. And in the end, we were stuck in there for about 3 hours. And after half an hour, 3 or 4 of the people were starting to really get really worked up about it. And for me, it was like, what the hell's the problem? We'll get out. It's not, they're almost like this incarceration syndrome where even if you know it's not, you can get out and do things. It does play on people's minds and it upsets them. And I understand that. I'm not diminishing that because that's a huge problem. There's the psychology of, is my job going to be there? Or is it not? What's the future? I live paycheck to paycheck. Yeah, there's all those elements, and we must never forget those. And it would be foolish to do that. But the problem is that there's the psychological aspect that you could start to unravel everything. All these lockdowns, things seem to be okay, and you do a bit more, and life seems to some extent be fairly normalized again. And then the second wave hits. And the psychological damage will be even greater than because then you're going to roll everything back and then people are going to go, oh my God, it's happened all over again. So the psychological impacts, however you handle this, the difference is with the Chinese and it's a completely different mindset to the West. They just accepted it. If we're locked down for 6 months, or like Wuhan, that's finally starting to just normalize to some extent, we're accepting it. They had a second wave that hit, and a city of 10 million people went into lockdown immediately, and they went, fine, we'll accept this. Now, that's not the Western attitude, so we can't make comparisons because people in the West don't react and behave that way. So the problem is the psychological elements in many ways, and the problem is if the second wave suddenly hits and you've unopened everything, you could then end up with a massive problem compared to what it is now. And we can argue, there's definitely, absolutely agree with you, there's many, I don't know, 10, 20%, maybe more of cases that have never been diagnosed, but there is equally cases, and it's now coming to pass in the UK, where there's people who've died of it and they haven't been recorded because it wasn't in hospital. So there's swings and roundabouts to this. But overall, yes, there is a significant percentage more of people who almost certainly had the virus. But then the problem is they don't know now whether you've had the virus, if you actually have any immunity going forward. That's not being understood one way or the other. That's another potential problem. So there is huge economic imperative to get everything back. But and all the psychology of how people are coping or not coping with what's going on, and that's absolutely critical. But you could take actions that in the long term have an even more devastating effect than trying to contain it now and sit it out. It doesn't mean locking people down is correct now, but we'll only know when we get to the end of this and it's all over. And then whatever happens, there's going to be people bleating with hindsight about how they were correct about things. But no, people are not going to be correct because they know. They're going to be just correct because just by chance, that's what ends up happening. But there's too many unknown factors economically, the psychology of it, the virus itself, that we have no understanding of. And that in itself poses huge problems. Now, I'm not saying every governor in the US has got a conscience or doesn't. But if I was sat there, I'd be like, okay, I see all the arguments. What the hell do I do? Because the honest truth is, we don't know. And this is the one thing, anyone can have opinions about the virus or opinions about it, but there is a lot of major factors we don't know. We don't understand the outcome. We don't know whether we're going to have immunity once we've had the virus. We don't know whether we can get the virus again. We don't know whether a second wave may have a completely different impact to the first, and whether people who got the first wave won't get the second wave. And these things we don't know. If we don't know this, the question is, what do we do? Do we just sit there and do nothing? No, but how do we do this? It's extremely problematic and extremely challenging. And that's the dilemma that faces every nation. Some nations to a lesser extent because they're very sparsely populated. New Zealand's one great example of that, which is now unlocking everything. It's had 1,000 cases and 20 deaths, I think. I mean, that you can't make comparisons. Everyone will go, oh, well, look what happened in New Zealand, or look at what happened in Sweden. That bears no resemblance to what may happen or won't happen or will happen in the UK, in Germany, in the United States, or in densely populated areas, as you say, like New York and parts of California. And these are the problems, you see. And that's what I find frustrating, is everyone's veering to different sides of this aisle. And I'm sat in the middle going, I wish we could have a discussion and some proper debate as to the real problems here. And
look, you hit the nail on
that just doesn't happen. And everyone's just get scattered to the opposite sides of the room and going, well, I'm in this position. I never want this lockdown to stop. And then everyone else there's other people going, I want the lockdown over. Where no one's sat in the middle, and that's where the problem is in every single nation, because we don't have these elected officials who seem to have any capability to do that. So,
for a couple things, when we, before, when we had major crises or global things like this, there were leaders that at least had the charisma and the right mindset. When you probably know from your history, when Germany was bombing the hell out of London, if it wasn't for somebody like Winston Churchill, who just exuded and brought people together, even though there was a potential of absolute destruction, people would have collapsed. They knew what to do. They did it because, hey, our leadership, they know what they're doing. They're in charge. We're just going to follow what they do. The same thing was FDR. When the Great Depression, he at least said, you know what, we're working on it. It doesn't mean that it's going to be perfect. And the fact of the matter is nature is far superior when it comes to outcomes than it comes to humans. You know what? People are going to die, and more people are going to die than in previous times, per capita, because there's more people out there. Okay, the population has tripled since 1918. So the numbers are going to be bigger in many capacities. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a far worse pandemic or such. My point is that we don't have unionized, leadership that is in union. Okay, the Democrats and Republicans are not looking at this as if this is something that we need to come together and we need to have unity to bring about the benefit of the country as a whole. The leadership is based on their own political ideologies. So the people do not have leaders that they can listen to or look to and say, okay, they're working on it. They're in charge. They know what's going on. You know, we can trust them. So we're going to go ahead, and it assuages their fears. Fact of the matter is that when Trump is trying to do the FDR and Churchill moment through his daily, all the people look at is the media sitting there asking stupid questions to try to get the gotchas and to screw them. Even the media is not standing on the side of the people. The politicians are not standing on the side of the people. The corporations are looking out for themselves. America is completely divided in ways. Is it any wonder that people are just amassed in fear? Because there's no direction. There's no, hey, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. It's going to, well, it's going to take some sacrifice. Dedication, towards this one goal. We don't have that. The world has changed, especially the United States. And so what happens in China, what happens in Russia is far different. What's happening in Britain is far different than what's happening in Europe. The European Union, they're not dedicated towards the one goal of getting Europe out of this. They're trying to use it as a political vehicle to reestablish the global continent, government. Italy can go hang. Germany's on side. This is the one thing that stands out to me more than anything, is that there is no world coming together or countries coming together to fight the thing. Instead, it's just another way to pretty much impose whatever ideological desire from so many different factors. And the common person like me, you, and the guy next door are sitting there going, you know what? Screw it. We got to look out for ourselves. And that's why some of the decisions being made at the local level by people is whether it's rebellion against the states, whether it's protests demanding that they open up the businesses. Hey, that's the mindset. Hey, I could get the virus and die. I don't care. I want a paycheck. That's the higher priority to me. So listen to me. I probably went off on too many tangents, but I think
no, you didn't. No, you didn't. What you said is absolutely, is correct. And the problem is, even if there was some modern day, leader who I'm not sure, even if they came out and said things, anyone would listen or believe in them. I mean, I think that's how bad things have got. Even if there was a Putin in the West, the people wouldn't listen. I mean, it's like Britain. I mean, Johnson's now back, recovered from the virus. He did a sort of press comp. Well, I'm not even, he did the other, what was it, yesterday, and he came out and okay, people will on different sides of the fence will agree, disagree with him, but he came out in a very, statesman-like way and said, this is what we want to do and this is how we want to do it. Where at least we have that. Now, there's going to be people for political reasons who love it and people who hate it. And that, because people are still obsessed with politics, well, that's fine, okay. But you sort of see at least there's an element of that. But even if someone in the US, forget Trump, just came out and said, I've got a vision, this is how we should do it, and this is how I recommend. And yeah, we're going to have massive problems and we're going to have to work really hard, but we're going to get through this eventually, and blah, blah, blah. Do you know, I don't think anyone would believe them. That's how bad things have got. So even if there was someone in that position to do that, then no one would listen to them. And the problem is, yeah, fear is, and I understand why people are fearful, and they feel like they have to take it into their own hands to do things because no one's listening to them. Well, the problem is that's fine and it's understandable, but what happens if you have a street full of people and they've got 20 different ideas and that, or ideas that are all different from each other, what happens? Who's in the right position to make those decisions and who isn't? And that's again is because there's a lack of leadership. People just lose faith, lose trust, lose hope, whatever that it might be, and they don't know how to react to this. So they'll feel, well, I'll just have to do this, and that is understandable. But the problem is I might think I should do one thing, and my next door neighbor thinks it wants to do something entirely different. What's right, what's wrong isn't it? That's not a cohesive way to deal with things, because the problem is I might do something that really infuriates them, and then that just causes hostility between me and my neighbor, for argument's sake, and we're not actually making any progress. But the problem is the level of distrust is so high that no one trusts. Even if someone did, like I say, came out with a bunch of ideas, and I mean, the trouble is, the media does jump all over Trump, and they're looking for him to trip himself up. But if you look at the catalogue, Trump's statements from January till now, he deserves to be slaughtered. If he was in this country, he would be laughed out of office. He has contradicted himself. He's made outrageous and absolutely ridiculous comments that have caused more damage than any of his opposition could ever have done to it. I mean, and that is an extremely stupid thing that he's done. I mean, yes, I can perfectly understand why he wants to do things, but he's made statements like he dismissed the virus as nothing. He then made out, well, we've got a vaccine soon. And he just didn't help the situation whatsoever. And, people will twist things he says out of context. And I agree with that. But and the media will jump all over him because they take great pleasure in doing this, which is extremely unhelpful. But he doesn't help himself. But the question is, where are the voices in the US to try and give people some guidance? They don't exist. And you're right, Europe's the same. There's all massive infighting going on as to how we bail out one nation from another, and the northern states are sick of the southern states because they should never have all been lumped together. Italy got left high and dry, and it's the Chinese, the Russians, and the Cubans. And it's the Chinese and the Russians are the ones who are sending aid all over the world and sending people to help. And they're the only nations actually doing something largely productive outside of their own country. And they're trying to show some sort of unified leadership, for want of a better word, and how we tackle this. But this is the state of the world we're in now, and it's only going to get infinitely worse before it gets better. So the problem is, how does any progress made when, and I've said this, you can't have any unified agreement amongst people, probably in a neighborhood, never mind in a state or in a broader sense across the US. So that poses enormous challenges. But the problem is, for me, I look at it this way, and my answer to what I should do or shouldn't do, I agree people shouldn't be incarcerated in houses. I mean, that is extremely detrimental, and that isn't the case here. You can go out and have some exercise. You can go to the shops. Yeah, there's nothing open, granted. Well, there's nothing open. That's extremely important. But I'm always kind of mindful that I'm not in a high risk category or any risk category in principle with regards to this virus. But does it mean I can't catch it and die? No. Well, what happens if I catch it and I do die as a result of it because I did something I shouldn't have done? There are consequences for me doing that. There affects a whole bunch of people in my life. And what happens if I do something and cause someone who's 80 years of age to get it because I may be asymptomatic and I don't know whether I am or I'm not? That's the kind of thing that goes through my head. So if I go out to the shop, I try to keep out of people's way. I try to be always mindful. It's not always easy and it can be difficult. But that's the kind of problem that for me is, and that doesn't mean we don't do anything, but we all deal with this differently. And how my perception of it doesn't have to represent everyone's views. But if someone's attitude is, well, I'm prepared to risk death because I want my paycheck, and I don't doubt people do that. Well, what happens if they're wanting to get that paycheck causes someone else to die or gets infected? Or what's the consequences for the rest of that person's family if they do die? We talk about psychological impact on things. I know this. We have to be extremely careful, and we don't blow this out of proportion. And yes, it is a small minority of people who get infected, and a small minority of people who die. But there's people in their 20s who've died in the UK. There's people who never thought it would be their problem who get infected and may have serious long-term health consequences. What's their viewpoint then? I put something on Twitter and someone got in touch with me. They had a relative who was always, this is ridiculous. Let's not have the lockdown. They then lost a young relative, and now they want everybody locked down and think it's outrageous. Well, that shows that the people are driven by their own individual circumstances, and they might change because suddenly their personal life circumstances, directly or indirectly in their family, may change. Well, then that's not a basis to make a decision. We have to make a decision from the outset that says, okay, I have to weigh up all the likelihood or the unlikelihood of what's going to happen. And that, I think, is an extremely important part of this, that, yeah, it does affect a small minority of people, but you might just be unlucky and be in that small minority of people. And what are the consequences if the worst comes to the worst? What does that do to those around you? Yeah. And that we have to literally boil it down to something as serious as that kind of level of debate. Because I think the problem is, it's always someone else's problem until it's their problem. And this is where the whole meltdown will be. It'll be everybody's problem. Because at the moment, there are destitute people in the United States who've got nothing. And a lot of it's through no fault of their own. But a lot of them get castigated and considered to be dropouts and delinquents in society. Well, maybe a lot of them are. And yet we're going to have this situation where that is going to end up applying to just about everybody in the future. So I think this is why I think it's extremely important that we don't make decisions based on the fact that we think we're immune to something or it's someone else's problem. That doesn't mean I want lockdown I don't want it. Does it mean we should have everything locked down now? No, it doesn't. But again, get some consensus in the middle of the room that says these extreme views of all lockdown, no lockdown is not applicable. What can actually be done? And try to have some consensus and get a better discussion, because all over Twitter, it's polarized everything. And if you try to put yourself in the middle, people either despise you for doing it, or they just try and ignore you or pretend you never said it. Well, that's where the reality is. And at the moment, with it, let's hope there is no second wave, but almost certainly there will be, or it's very minimal. And we can look back in the future and go, well, thank goodness that's been and gone. And with hindsight, it was the right decision to do these things. But we don't know. And here's the point. At some point in the future, there's going to be a virus even worse than this one that's going to afflict humanity. And this is an inevitability. And it's not some grand conspiracy. This is going to happen. How are we going to deal with that in the future? And after we get out the end of this, because people will just forget it and pretend it never happened. And these are the problems we have. And for me, I just think we have to step back occasionally and go, what's the broader perspective of this? Not how does it affect me on an individual basis? What is the context of this in a broader perspective? And that isn't about locking people down. That's about every perspective. I'm not saying we should lock everyone down before any, because I know people will think that's what I'm alluding to. I'm saying there has to be an understanding that you have to get the balance right and do things like you said, Kat, in how we do things. But the problem is, as well, is that doesn't mean we put ourselves individually at risk because we think it's someone else's problem. Because someone else's problem may become our problem and a whole bunch of other people's problems by what we do or don't do. And that is, for me, I cannot emphasize how extremely important it is that we think this way.
Ken, any closing thoughts?
No, I think we've actually touched upon so many different perspectives on what's going on, and you know, for better like terms, we've actually come to a consensus. Yes, like the doctors do, we've come to a consensus. Absolute agreement. You know, the thing about it is you can't do things to extremes. You can't do a full lockdown and pretty much shut everything down, but at the same time, you can't act like it's no big deal and just do business as usual. Hopefully, with everything, you know, with countries starting to open up a little bit, with states starting to open up here as we get towards May, that leadership will pay attention day to day, week to week, and see what's happening, and from there make the adjustments rather than the you know, Damocles sword coming down on the system, and try to make it where it's both safe and you know, freedom for people to be able to do what's necessary, because during these summer months is the time when the flu bugs usually are dormant or die off, and it's during that time that you prepare for winter, just in case that second wave does come.
Yep, absolutely. Gentlemen, thank you for a great discussion, and for our subscribers, thank you once again for your support. We'll get this uploaded later on to the Gadfly site. And for those tuning in for the first time for a live stream, please again consider going to our site, thegadfly.bhx.tv, and sign up for a 30-day free trial of our content, which, you know, great contributors, Jim Willie, London Paul, Ken Shortgen Jr., and then also support their individual work. And gentlemen, enjoy the rest of your day. And for our listeners, enjoy your day as well. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks, everyone.